Before we start the show, we have a special announcement. This fall, the Analytics Power Hour crew is headed to Measure Camp Chicago.
That's right. Even your co-host from all the way in Australia will be there on Saturday, September 7 to join in all the unconference Measure Camp fun.
Oh, I'm so excited that we're all going to be together. Well, except we'll be missing Josh, but we'll have him there in spirit. But I'm curious. I've never been to a Measure Camp. What's it like?
What's it like? Okay, well, I've been to one of them in Europe, and I've been to, I think, all of the ones that have been in person in the U.S., and to me, kind of the most iconic feature is that the schedule is created on the day of the event, and everyone who attends is encouraged to actually lead a session based on whatever they're finding most interesting or most useful, or even maybe what's kind of vexing them the most of late. So it's really all about an exchange of ideas and having some really in-depth and rich discussions with your peers.
I've also been to quite a few, and I've also helped with planning the one we run in Sydney. And the truth is, it's just phenomenal. It's better than Christmas Day, honestly. And one of my favorite parts of Measure Camp is that they're held on a Saturday, so it doesn't interfere with your work, and the tickets are always free.
Yeah, and I loved my experience at Measure Camp Austin earlier this year. I mean, it was so accessible to everybody, and it was so fun. Okay, so what are we going to be doing there?
So we're going to be doing a couple things. So the first is we're going to have a room booked for us all day long where you can stop by and visit a couple of the co-hosts and talk about what you've been talking about throughout the day, or maybe one of the sessions you're presenting. And we're also going to have a couple questions posted up on the board day of, and you can come in and give us your answer to those prompts. And then at the end of the day during the happy hour, we're also going to do a short live show.
Will there be shots?
So mark your calendars for Saturday, September 7th at 9 a.m. at the Leo Burnett Building, downtown Chicago, right on the river and just a couple of blocks from Michigan Avenue.
Get your free tickets now by heading to bit.ly/APH-Chicago and start thinking now about what you might like to present or talk about.
Awesome. We're headed to Chicago, but now let's start the show.
Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. Analytics topics covered conversationally and sometimes with explicit language.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Analytics Power Hour. I'm Tim Wilson, and this is episode number 250. So bear with me for a minute while I get a little philosophical on a path to getting real, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Real data. Actually, real world data, which, I think we know when we actually stop and think about it, but do we remember to stop and think about the real world as often as we should? I mean, 10,000 visitors to a website, as reported in, say, Pilwick Pro, represents 10,000 people. I mean, give or take, I know a hit is not a person, a visitor is not a person, but stick with me. It's roughly 10,000 human beings in the real world who were navigating our website on their phones or their tablets or their laptops, and they were doing real things, taking real actions. Human beings can make for pretty unpredictable and messy data generators, though. So we thought it'd be useful and interesting to step out of the real world data that I and my co-host for this episode come from, which is primarily digital and marketing and product, and poke around in healthcare data and the real world data therein. Julie Hoyer, you're an analytics lead at Further. Did you actually know before we started prepping for this show that RWD, real world data, and RWE, real world evidence, and RWI, real world insights, were actually formalized concepts in healthcare analytics?
No, to be honest, I had no idea, and I can't wait to learn more about them.
Me either. And Val Kroll, head of delivery at Facts and Feelings, are you excited to add RWD and RWE and RWI as complements to RCTs in your personal lexicon?
Sure am. Louis, you have your work cut out for you.
Well, as I said, we're going to be talking about healthcare analytics on this episode. And while all three of us as co-hosts have been involved with the marketing side of healthcare, we're actually talking about things like drug discovery and treatment efficacy and patient outcomes when we're talking about real-world data in this context, and we needed to bring in someone who is deeply knowledgeable to wade into that territory. Lewis Carpenter is the director of real-world evidence at Arcturus Data, where he is responsible for insight generation from unstructured data that comes in from healthcare data providers, with the end goal being to generate real-world evidence insights across a range of disease areas that inform the drug discovery process. I know, it's kind of wild, right? Lewis has a PhD in medical statistics, did postdoc work at King's College London, has held a variety of medical statistician roles, and those all led to him leading the real-world evidence team at Arcturus Data. And today he is our guest. So welcome to the show, Lewis.
Hello, Tim, and hello, Julie and Val. Lovely to be here.
Awesome. So I think maybe the best place to start may be with some definitions. I referenced RWD and RWE and RWI and RCTs as different acronyms already. So Lewis, can you maybe start by giving us kind of an explain it to my mother level of overview of those different terms?
Absolutely. I think if there's one sector that I've ever worked in that loves an acronym, I think it's healthcare and pharmacy. So I appreciate it can be quite challenging to get through all of the different acronyms. So real world data is, as I think you really put well at the beginning in the intro, is essentially any data that arises through the real world or day-to-day routine care within the healthcare provider. Obviously, I'm based in the UK, so this is largely through records that are collected as you interact with the National Health Service that we have in the UK. I think these can be things like records that are collected by the doctor, but they can also be quite broader. So we've got the advent of wearable technologies, for example. And so real world data can also encompass the data that's collected as you're wearing those wearables. And, you know, it might be sleep-based data or sort of heart rhythm-based data. And essentially, it's things that are not influenced by anything else. Real world evidence is thankfully a little bit simpler. It's just the evidence that you generate from that real world data. Now, where the other acronyms around sort of randomized control trials and that kind of aspects come in is these are potentially how we can also differentiate it really, which is you have interventional studies and you have non-interventional studies. So real world data are very much non-interventional studies. No one's providing any difference to routine care or sort of deviating from established protocols. Whereas in randomized control trials or RCTs, you are experimentally manipulating an aspect of that patient's care, and therefore you're moving into the interventional space. So in most cases, you're randomizing patients to receive a treatment or not receive a treatment, and therefore you are having an influence on the care they're getting, and that's why it differentiates from real world evidence and real world data in that context. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of those acronyms.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I was digging into this, it was just the contrast to sort of the business or the marketing analytics, where in the last 20 years, when everything's been digitized, I feel like the marketing analytics it's been using just the real world data. That's kind of the default, is we have all this behavioral data that we're able to observe and collect. And then when it comes to RCTs or A/B testing or controlled experimentation, whatever, and it, you know, maybe A/B testing is kind of the more common vernacular in marketing. That's kind of this is kind of the exception, which it seems like it's kind of the opposite in medical, that the default was more the gold standard because you're dealing with people's health and lives, and the real world data and how can analytical techniques be used to get real evidence, like reliable evidence out of that, is, I mean, a little bit more of kind of an upstart. Like, is that a fair framing, that it's a contrast to RCTs? Like, you can get stuff out of this. Everything doesn't have to be an RCT.
I think, yeah, and I think that's fair and certainly a good representation of where the evidence is at the moment. I mean, I've been working in this field for the good sort of 10, 15 years now. And to be honest, the term real world evidence wasn't that ubiquitous across the field. It was actually just largely called epidemiological studies. And so the use of real world evidence and how it's being implemented has changed over the last sort of five odd years. But what I would say to your point is that, yes, whilst there's this kind of this differentiation and certainly real world evidence is being used within to generate evidence that you potentially would be interested in from a randomized control trial or an interventional trial, the use of the different types of data is really driven by the research question that you're trying to answer. And that's really the key aspect. So a lot of the sort of real world data, the population level data, is answering one question, and the randomized control trial is trying to answer quite a different question. And I'm very happy to get into exactly what those questions are and why they're different and what the pros and cons of the different data to answering those questions are later. But that's usually the driver. And I think actually listening to your analytics podcast where you're sort of talking about the analytical approach that you would take is kind of driven by the research question. The sort of data that you want as well is driven by the research question as well.
It's time to step away from the show for a quick word about Piwik Pro. Tim, tell us about it.
Well, Piwik Pro has really exploded in popularity and keeps adding new functionality.
They sure have. They've got an easy-to-use interface, a full set of features with capabilities like custom reports, enhanced e-commerce tracking, and a customer data platform.
We love running Piwik Pro's free plan on the podcast website, but they also have a paid plan that adds scale and some additional features.
Yeah, head over to piwik.pro and check them out for yourself. You can get started with their free plan. That's piwik.pro. And now let's get back to the show.
That was going to be my follow-up question, actually, was I would love to hear like examples of the difference between the questions that you would use each one for.
Perfect, yeah. So I think a very typical question you'll get within real-world evidence side would be, in the UK, or we could say US, or any sort of geographic region, there is a new drug being used. How often is that drug being used, and in what patient groups is it being used? That would be a very sort of typical, what we call actually pharmacoepidemiological study, which is basically an understanding of how drugs are being used within a given population. And so for that, clinical trials is an incredibly expensive and time-consuming way of doing it. To go through and try and enroll people and sort of follow them up over many years to understand the different drugs they're using is just not practical. And of course, there's no actual need to have any intervention or change to treatment. You want to understand naturally how are these drugs being used within the sort of healthcare authority that you're interested in. And so that will be the main driver for a lot of real-world data and real-world evidence type of questions, is just understanding how things are being done within the healthcare setting. Randomized control trials are very much specific to one type of question, and that is, how effective is a drug relative to another drug or relative to a placebo? And that is really what it's set up to do. Now, as I mentioned, real-world evidence is kind of moving into that territory, and sort of we're starting to explore the ways in which real-world data can start answering questions around drug efficacy. But really, in order to do that well, it all comes from study design and data collection. And that's really underpins the ability to answer that question in a really unbiased way. And that's where randomized control trials will always continue to be the gold standard. So you typically will see there's a really nice diagram that's quite ubiquitous across the literature around sort of hierarchy of evidence within healthcare. And it usually starts with sort of case studies and sort of anecdotal evidence from clinicians is kind of the lowest level, and then moves up to observational data, randomized control trial data. And then at the top, we have something called a systematic literature review, which is essentially a collection of all trials that are run in that space. So rather than just leveraging one trial, you're leveraging, 6 or 7 trials that have done it and sort of saying on average, what does it say? Now, that one has always been a little bit contentious because it's sort of seen as the hierarchy of evidence across all research questions. The reality is it's the hierarchy of evidence for treatment effect, but it's not necessarily the hierarchy for observational research, where we're interested in, as I said, how medications are being used within a healthcare setting. So that's why you tend to get this sort of bias where, the randomized control trials is very good for one particular thing, whereas, you might want to use a different design and a different data set for a different research question.
So interesting. And I was actually reading on your site one of the case studies that was published about the external control arm, and fully admitting I was hanging on to like 85% of what it was talking through. But could you talk a little bit about how that plays into the way that you're dealing with like trials that are happening and creating that, the way you're able to help like estimate the actual efficacy and kind of creating that third kind of trend line. And hopefully this isn't too specific of an example, but I would love to hear the interplay of that with the RCTs.
Definitely. So maybe as a little bit of pretext to that, one of the challenges with real world data is that essentially, I always draw sort of comparisons with some of the data that you guys work with in sort of marketing and finance and elsewhere, where essentially, exactly as you said, Tim, the observational real world use of sort of finance or how users are interacting with a website is kind of the the end all and be all of kind of what you're trying to ascertain. So essentially, in order for you to understand how people are interacting with it, that is the obvious way in which you would collect data. So it's kind of almost almost a single kind of data collection problem. And as you said, you would only move to A/B testing if you were sort of wanting to go, okay, what's the effect of tweaking one parameter or tweaking one potential aspect of the way in which the users are interacting. Healthcare data, I think, sits a little bit differently, and its biggest challenge is that it's not collected for research purposes. It can be, but we're in the context of things like electronic health records, where we're essentially just collecting data that's been for patients that are going through the healthcare setting. They're not collected for research purposes, and behind every decision for a treatment or for a laboratory test or for a diagnostic test or for a scan is a clinician making that decision. And so inherently, that data is biased because every interaction a patient had is led by a decision that clinician has made on the balance of that particular patient presentation. And that's the real fundamental sort of bias that comes through with real-world data, is that you're trying to understand, well, I can't just compare patients that get a treatment and patients that don't get a treatment, because there's a fundamental reason why those patients didn't get that treatment and why they did. So the differences between those two groups goes well beyond just the fact that they received or didn't receive a particular treatment. So that's, with that little bit of pretext, we kind of come to how real world data can ever then be used for treatment efficacy. So one of the sort of biases that I usually teach and sort of talk to is something called, to that point, which is called confounding by indication. There's a bias that happens because the indication that patient has had that treatment for is being confounded by the fact that the clinician has made a choice about giving that treatment. So it might be the case, for example, that if you give one type of treatment, that's for a particularly sick patient group. So you would only ever reserve this treatment when a patient gets really, really severe. So if you compared that treatment with patients who didn't get it, you might think, and you might wrongly assume, because if you look at the data for, say, mortality and compare that between the patients who get it and don't get it, you go, well, hang on, people on that drug are dying far more regularly than people not on it. And you would wrongly assume that the drug is causing increased mortality. The reality is that no, it's a confounding by indication. They're being indicated that drug because they've got more severe disease, and they're obviously dying more because they have more severe disease. So these are the real challenges that happen with real world data, and why you need to be really sort of consider the confounding and the biases that occur. So how do we do it then, particularly within the context of external control arms, and why do we do them? So one of the challenges with randomized control trials on the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned earlier, is that they are time consuming and they're very costly. It takes years and years to plan these trials, and then to enroll that out, recruit the patients and identify them, and then collect the data over, say, a 3-year program can take, upwards of 7 to 10 years typically. And you're looking at quite niche patient groups as well. There's very strict criteria that determines whether a patient could go into that trial or not. Now, there are instances, particularly within rare diseases, for example, where it's both logistically really challenging to find enough patients that you can actually randomize them to either be on the treatment or to be on not the treatment. And that might be a placebo or the current best standard of treatment. And there's an ethical consideration. Most patients will enroll into a clinical trial because they're hopeful that they're going to get randomized to receive the treatment. And so particularly with rare diseases where there's not many treatment options, is it ethical to randomize a patient to not receive a potentially life-saving, and obviously we don't know its effect, but there's a potential that there's an improved effect, hence we're testing it. Is it ethically right to deny them access to that? And so people are thinking, well, it would be great if we could just do what we call single-arm trials, where essentially we give patients all the intervention. So we don't randomize them. Everybody gets the intervention. But then the problem is, well, I have nothing to compare it to. So I know that the drug is effective, but how do I know how much relatively is it better compared to, say, standard treatment or no treatment? And so this is where people are looking at different sources of data to say, can I create a control arm that is external to the trial that I can then compare the single arm intervention data with? And then I can get an idea of how comparatively better this treatment is. And that's where, particularly with the advent of electronic health records, where we're getting a huge amount of data being collected electronically in cloud storage, allowing us to access that data, we're starting to see that we can identify patients who look very, very similar to the trial patients who are getting the intervention, but the only difference is that they don't have the intervention, whereas obviously the patients in the intervention trial do. We then have also got a whole repertoire of methodologies that we've developed over the last 10, 15 years in medical statistics that says we can do more. We can do some really cool sort of propensity matching based methods that allow us to try and adjust for those confounding effects. So we can make sure that age is not a confounder here. We can make sure that, gender and ethnicity and other clinical factors are balanced between the two groups statistically, as well as making sure that they look very similar. And therefore, we're getting closer to being able to derive an effect, which is basically telling us what's the difference between these two groups. And we can be more confident that's purely attributed to the drug and nothing else. So that's kind of what we're trying to achieve with external control arms, and particularly with real world data in that essence.
Is there ever a concern that the bias is like how they figure out or decide to go into the trial? Like, is that something that would be trying to control for their doctor, the level of care they're getting? Like, because I understand like creating that external arm, which sounds amazing, but I do wonder like if the mechanism for them getting into the trial, is that something you guys are concerned about? And do you ever have to control for like aspects around the HCP or doctor, healthcare provider? And do you have that information? Like, my brain's going down this rabbit hole.
It's a great one. So I could probably actually tease apart two different aspects for that question, which is the first one is a lot of the time the clinical trial setup, and I realize I haven't given a pretty good definition of what a randomized control trial is, but I'm happy to do that if we think that'll be useful for the listeners. But the setup for a trial and how you determine whether someone is eligible or ineligible to be in a trial is often based on a number of sort of eligibility criteria, and these are typically inclusion and exclusion criteria, that tries to make the patient group as homogeneous as possible so that you can basically derive the treatment effect is really, really pinpointed, because essentially you're trying to get rid of noise. I think that's probably the best way of explaining it. Get rid of as much noise as possible so that I know the exact effect of that drug when compared to not having it. Now, those eligibility criteria are great at making a really homogeneous group, but what they suffer in is that they then become quite difficult to generalize beyond that really, really homogeneous and specific group. I use an analogy of actually with cars in this space, so I'm going to go down this rabbit hole and hope that it makes sense. But when you're trying to buy a car, you might be interested in the miles per gallon that it does. So the way in which we can do a standardized comparison between two different cars is that we take them on a really rigorous test that's really, really specific. So they only drive at 50 miles an hour, the amount they accelerate, the amount they brake, the amount they turn is all standardized so that when I run one car around it, I can directly compare it to another car, and I know that it's not because they drove faster or that there was different conditions and things like that. So that test is really good at allowing you to go, compared to that car, this one is 5 miles per gallon better than that one. Right. So that's almost what the randomized control trial doing is, a very, very standardized and controlled experiment. It can tell you what the difference is. But of course, we know that the claimed miles per gallon on any car advert is wildly different to what we actually achieve when we go and do it in the real world. And that's where exactly the same problem with randomized control trials come in. They tell you what the effect of the drug is relative to not getting it. But when we actually give it to patients outside in the real world sort of setting, we sometimes notice we're not seeing that same effect. Like, we're not getting that same amount of sort of efficacy within the real world. And it's because the randomized control trial is just not very representative. And so to your point, Julie, I think one of the really cool things is can we tweak the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the trial to make it more inclusive and to make it more generalizable so that essentially it's more representative of actually what's going to happen when the trial is actually authorized and used in that healthcare setting. So that's one really sort of strong aspect about sort of actually there's a lot about the design of a trial that we can use, and we can use real world data to help inform that. So we can understand if you do and don't have that criteria, how does your population change, and do you exclude a lot of people, particularly ethnic minority groups that are typically underrepresented? We know that there's a huge bias to white male populations within clinical trials. And so understanding, well, what's their effect in ethnic minority groups? What's their effect in women? How does the dosage affect those sort of things? So trying to go, well, maybe there are certain criteria that are, weighted against those type of underrepresented groups that if we expanded would give us better representation within the trial settings. And then I had a second point, but I've completely forgotten. So I will try and remember that in a bit.
Well, I have a plethora of back questions that I'm thinking about. So you can think about that while I ask this. Will probably be a simple one. I'm just curious because obviously, like you've alluded to, the process of these trials today is like really long, really arduous, but that's in place so that we can get that really solid approval from, the government, FDA, NHS to say, this drug is indicated for this type of disease state or whatever the symptoms that the patient is experiencing. Are some of the things that you're talking about here as accepted for saying like even those like single arm trials? Could you get a drug approved with those types of testing or with that type of rigor? Or does that have to run alongside it? Or are there any types of methodologies that you're still hoping become the green light for certain drugs getting the final approval?
Yeah, great question. And I think you've really hit here on a really kind of raging debate, which is between the sort of clinical trial and real world evidence space here. So the two schools of thinking are clinical trials are heavily bureaucratic and heavily red taped. And actually, a lot of the reasons that we don't run them in a lot of these different contexts is because it's costly and time consuming to do so. I think particularly from COVID, we've seen how when there's a clear impetus and a clear sort of desire to move quickly, and there's a need to move quickly, we can actually accelerate the approval process and still maintain the same level of rigor and experimentation that's needed to get a fully safe and authorized and effective new treatment, such as the COVID vaccines that were released. So that school of thinking is around, rather than trying to overcome the problem by replacing it with something else, maybe we should just try to make and streamline the process of randomized control trial itself, because then that will increase the sort of uptake of them. So that's one school of thinking. And the other school of thinking is, that's great, and I think we should do that, but there's always going to be those use cases where actually doing a fully randomized trial is going to be too difficult, or that we need the evidence much quicker than is available through a randomized control trial. So yes, do that as well. Reduce the bureaucracy and reduce the costs and times associated with conducting randomized control trials, but we might as well leverage the data that we have access to. And I think, as I say, particularly within rare diseases, where actually it doesn't matter how much red tape and bureaucracy you take away, if they're incredibly rare diseases, it's always going to be really challenging to get enough patients and enroll them. And as I say, the ethical challenges that come with it. The sort of thinking there is, why wouldn't you try to leverage this analysis and this data, real world data, to supplement that clinical trial data to give you a better understanding? And I think we're certainly seeing that, particularly with the rise of more and more precision medicine. So particularly within oncology and other areas, there's a drill down to very, very specific genetic subtypes and particular types of tumors and things like that, where medicines are targeting that on a very precision-based level, and therefore your population sizes are getting smaller and smaller. And so the need to sort of introduce these medicines much quicker is becoming quite clear, and therefore it's not always possible to wait for a fully randomized trial. So I think what we're seeing at the moment, and this is this landscape as I see it, is that regulators such as FDA, EMA, and NICE in the UK are using the sort of single arm trial data supplemented with real world data to give them that comparator data to look at accelerating the approval of things like cancer medications and other medications in early access schemes. So these are typically, whilst they allow access, but they're still monitoring its use. So there's still some ambiguity about whether they're fully effective and a good cost benefit for that health system. And obviously this is much more poignant in the NHS, where we have quite strict regulations on approval for medications and the cost effectiveness of those medications. Less so in the US, where you obviously got a lot more of an insurance-based system. But the idea is essentially you have it on and you allow it to be used over a sort of a year period while you're still collecting data, while you're still finalizing clinical trial programs. And then after a year, you reassess and you go, okay, we've had this for a year now. Do we think we should move this to a routine provisioning? And certainly, in the work that I've done, some of the work that the team have produced here at Arcturus, we are actually leveraging that real world external control arm data to help make regulatory decisions, which is fantastic to see. Translatable evidence-based medicine is kind of what I've loved and dreamed of doing for so many years. And it's great to sort of see the work that we're doing now translating so sort of tangibly to the uptake of new drugs that are really effective. So I certainly certainly think there's appetite, and the likes, those different bodies themselves are actually releasing guidance to help us understand how we can use this data, what's the best practice. And so there are a lot of methodological and sort of analytical questions as well still. So I could go and talk to days about sort of how we're handling missing data, how we're dealing with different bootstrap estimators and variance estimation problems and propensity scores and all of that kind of stuff. So it's quite fun to be in as a medical statistician to sort of see that and pioneer those methods, but also just seeing them being uptake. But there's definitely appetite for them.
I'm struck, and I don't know if this is the language that gets used as you're talking. It sounds like it really is kind of an uncertainty reduction play, that the real world data can reduce it to some extent. Sure, an RCT would reduce it further, but for practical or cost or time reasons, that's not necessarily available. You said a while back that it was, in the marketing or the business context, sort of coming at it from just the observational data. I feel like the challenge that we have on the business side is that we don't have kind of that gold standard orientation of how we're using little r, little w, little d, real world data, and we're treating it like it is giving us a higher level of uncertainty reduction. Whereas it seems like in healthcare, that's kind of the standard. So now you're having to look at it being more critical of how the data is being used and what techniques can be applied. And it feels like, I'm curious if that's when you have all these different techniques, is it saying what limitation of the real world data is this addressing, and to what extent is it able to address it? Like, is that the framing? Like how much closer is this getting? How much is this moving us up the hierarchy of evidence with each added complexity that's being introduced in an analytical technique?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you put it perfectly in terms of it's almost a trade-off, and you're constantly working out, how do I trade off the increased potential burden by not having the medication being used, by waiting longer, by not being able to have a fully randomized control trial, versus how much am I certain that there is a cost benefit to this, introducing this new drug? And exactly as you say, all of these techniques and these methods are trying to slowly chip away at that uncertainty so that regulators can make a more informed decision about whether they should. And a lot of the time they will land on the fact that they just don't think there is sufficient evidence to approve it. And particularly given some of the really strict thresholds that we have here in the UK, a lot of the time you'll hear, potentially very effective medications not being approved because they just don't meet those cost thresholds that are required for its uptake in the NHS. And that's just a result of having, a finite health resource that we do and the setup that we have here in the NHS. And obviously I appreciate that's also true across different healthcare nations, but of course the way you pay for it and reimburse it is different. I think the methods they will get you so far. I'm reminded of a really good paper by Hanan and his colleagues, which really hits on the fact that statistical methods will be able to do a lot in terms of helping you understand, the relative differences and help you try to reduce the uncertainties around those biases that exist. But really, it comes to fundamental research methods and study planning. It's all about planning your study well. And the randomized control trial sort of epitomizes what a perfect experimental design looks like if you want to know how much better is this drug if I took it versus I didn't take it. Because essentially that's the answer we're doing. We're trying to sort of essentially deal with a hypothetical situation which we can never recreate, which is if we take like an aspirin, for example, what you want to do is you're going to go, I have a headache, I'm going to take an aspirin to see whether it gets rid of the headache. In order to know exactly what the effect of that aspirin was, I need to be in another parallel universe where there's a counterfactual version of me that everything else is exactly the same, except I don't take the aspirin. And then after, say, an hour or 2 hours, I can then determine, did my headache go away or didn't it? And then I would know, if I could compare those two parallel counterfactuals, I'd know exactly what the effect of the aspirin was. And the randomized control trial basically is a way of trying to design that type of experiment. So we can certainly do a lot with statistical methods, and being a medical statistician, I do have probably a bias towards, the impact that those can have. But I think what's really key is actually understanding just because real world data is biased and you maybe found a biased result, it might be because you just poorly designed that experiment to begin with. In the same way that you can have a poorly designed randomized trial that doesn't quite get to the heart of what you wanted to do, you can have poorly designed real world data studies. And I think that's a real key thing for me, which is you can't just sort of go, well, it was either the stats methods weren't good enough or there was a bias in the data. It was actually maybe I didn't make the right decisions. And so there's a big framework at the moment around actually in our real world data studies, we should do something called a target trial emulation, which is you go, I'm going to design a randomized control trial in a setting that I don't think I can do a randomized control trial setting. How can I replicate that exact design in my real world data? And you follow exactly the same principles about how you would design a trial. So who's going to be in it? What are my endpoints? How do I determine when I'm observing those patients for, to make sure you minimize all the potential biases that happen? And then it's only that way that you can be sure that actually the effect is there or not there, or there may be other biases that you can't account for.
Can I ask a marketing scenario and get your reaction? Even if you don't have an answer, I would just love your reaction. Because after everything we've been talking about, I just keep going back to one of the most frustrating things I run into for a long time now. And it is, let's say we're marketing to different segments of healthcare providers. And usually we are not part of deciding these segments. They have been decided. And as soon as you start asking questions about the segments, you find out that they've said, for example, we have split these healthcare providers into, 5 groups, and it's all dependent on how much they prescribe the product we're interested in. And then we're going to take these groups based on if they're, loyalists, they prescribe this product a lot, to the people who are dabblers or non-existent and they barely prescribe this product. And then we're going to market to them differently because they've shown different levels of interest in our product. And then we're going to come to you, analyst, that's me on this end getting this question. How effective was our marketing on making people more loyal? And I just sit there and think, you have a self-fulfilling segment. There are people with a lot of different attributes, and I have never won this argument. I mean, a lot of it is because they're given these segments from different teams and things. But with that scenario, how would you, 1, react to it, and 2, would you actually use best practices of, RWE designs to tackle that?
Right. So, very good question. So if I've understood the sort of premise right, so correct me if I'm going through this and then you're going, hang on, you've really got the wrong end of the stick here. But I think my reaction initially is exactly as you said, the ways in which you're already setting up to try and basically determine the effect of the marketing on those different groups is already biased by the fact that they're ranked by how well they are already prescribing that medication. I can see why intuitively they would want to do that, because they would basically want to go, well, these are my low performers. I want to see the bigger effect on those versus those that I already know are there. So really, what I think you could probably do is take the same kind of approach that we do, as I was mentioning earlier, that target trial emulation. So really what you want to go through is kind of set up experimentally, how would you design a randomized control trial in this case, where essentially you get a whole bunch of healthcare providers that are not biased, but they're not ranked, or they're unknown about what their prescription levels are. You would randomly allocate them to either receive the marketing or not receive the marketing. And then afterwards, over a set period of time, you would then compare them and say, well, the people that were marketed on average had a higher level of increased in prescriptions versus those that didn't have the marketing. So you can sort of take that premise and go, well, how do I apply that to the fact that I'm not going to randomize, these healthcare providers? I'm just going to monitor them over time. And really, that's kind of why I think my instinct here is that it's biased, because you wouldn't start from the premise of going, well, I'm going to randomize them and stratify them based on how much they're already prescribing that, because you would go, well, hang on, that doesn't quite make sense. So that's probably the approach I would take. And I think you could probably look at potential biases that can come, from the approach you're already doing. And there's ways in which you can quantify it. So that's quite cool, because I think one of the traps you can get into with real world data is people go, well, the data's biased, so we can't do it. And therefore, there's no point in looking at it. But probably the more sensible and more sort of productive thing is going, well, we know there are biases. I agree with you. There definitely are biases in this data because it's not experimentally controlled. But that doesn't mean that the finding is therefore completely null. It might be still a valid finding, even though there are some biases that play with it. So actually, the more sensible thing is to go, well, let me quantify that bias and let me determine how much of an effect that bias is actually having on the outcome or the result that I want to prove. And there's a really great case study where this was used in smoking, actually, because it's not feasible to randomize people to have cigarettes and not have cigarettes to work out what's the impact of lung cancer from it. But we're pretty sure that there is a very, very strong association between cigarette smoking and cancer and lung cancer. So what they did in this actually came from a lot of tobacco industry. They were saying, well, you're only using real world data. You're only using observational data, non-interventional data. So we're not certain that data that has some biases and that might be into play. So they've gone, well, we can show that people who don't smoke versus that do smoke, and we've tried to control for things like age and other medical conditions to make sure that they're there. And we can see an effect. We can see, we can derive an output. In this case, it's a sort of a hazard ratio. So how much more on average are patients having lung cancer versus not having lung cancer over a period of time? So they said, well, okay, well, yes, we agree. There could be a sense of bias, but that doesn't mean that it nullifies the effect of tobacco on lung cancer. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, let's assume there's another confounding effect. There's some other unmeasured confounder that is having a play on the association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. How big does that effect need to be before it nullifies the association between cigarettes and lung cancer? And what they found was that this effect had to be absolutely huge, right? There had to be a monumental unknown confounder that nobody thought of, with a huge effect on both of those two, on the stratification and the outcome, before it actually got rid of the statistical effect of that association itself. So they're going, A, this is incredibly unlikely, and B, it has to be so large that actually we're pretty confident that the association is true. So there's loads of different ways in which you can sort of try to overcome the potential biases that happen. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, it all comes to study design. So I think in your case, just going, well, how would I operationalize it? How would I experimentalize that? If that's a word, I don't think it is. How would I make that into an experiment?
It is now.
It is now.
As I say, you coined it. You heard it here first.
I mean, it's funny, Julie, because the question is, this is like working with one side of a shop of a pharma company that has the other side of the same pharma company is absolutely immersed in RCTs and RWE. So it's like, you're not even trying to make the case with just, a widget manufacturer who has no exposure to this at all. It's one where you're like that, but look, your colleagues, in the R&D world, they would absolutely mock you. And I know in those organizations, those groups don't really intersect or overlap, but that's kind of what the tragedy of it. It's like, oh my God, your colleagues in R&D would just be embarrassed. They'd be mortified if they heard what you were doing. But those groups just don't interact. Can I ask you, you brought up the regulators and their acceptance of RWE or not, and I could put myself in the shoes of a regulator who is used to having this high up on the evidence hierarchy RCT data, and they have the added, there's the risk aversion that if I'm going to approve something that is solely RWE based, and then it turns out later it was rolled out and there was a trial or people do die, that's going to come back on me. Is there a bias for the regulators to say, I don't want this to roll out because the downside is, well, it never hits the market, but there's a counterfactual that's unobserved. If I do roll it out, then there's the upside that it might have a positive effect on health outcomes, but there's a downside that I've got more uncertainty than if I did an RCT, which is it could be bad. It could have adverse effects. And therefore, as a human being, as a regulator, I'm going to keep that bar really high. Do you run into that it's you have to clear that bar because they're it's risky?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I think, it's such a staple and again, I'm just sort of reminder in terms of we'll be very much focused on sort of the treatment efficacy side. I mean, obviously there are other research questions which are important as well, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that the concept of randomized control trials as being the gold standard for very, very correct and obvious reasons is kind of almost embedded, and that there's a responsibility from their point of view to only authorize medications that they have certainty over their effectiveness. And like you said, every medication will have side effects, so there will always be a potential harm that could occur, even if, okay, it's not as effective as the current medication, but there's a cost implication, and obviously in national health services, that's a big factor, and obviously for US in terms of insurance premiums and so forth. And then there's also exactly that, the sort of trade-off of going, well, if this creates more harm, because a lot of these medications they can have quite bad sort of safety profiles in terms of creating adverse events. So I completely agree, and I think it will take time before sort of people are more amenable to different types of evidence. But I think it still hits to the fact, if you can, the one thing that they're certainly very tight on is that there has to be incredibly good justification for why you're not doing a randomized control trial. So I think that will always be the first question: is there any justifiable reason why a randomized control trial cannot be conducted other than it will take take a longer time or be costly? Because those are not going to be factors that the regulator is going to be concerned about, other than, of course, obviously, if it is a potentially effective medication that is delaying that uptake, which is why things like we've got something called the Cancer Drugs Fund, or CDF, here in the UK, where we can manage access to the drug earlier as it's still being assessed. But I think it will take time, and as more and more sort of we integrate real world data into that clinical trial and start using and developing those methods and understanding where does it work and where doesn't it work, because I think that's the key part, right? Because there was a fantastic initiative called I think it was called RCT Emulate, which essentially took a large number of randomized control trials, emulated them with real world data, and saw how similar or different were they to the results of the randomized control trial, and trying to understand, okay, there's a lot of cases where I could emulate it perfectly, but there's a lot of cases where I got very different results. And of course, the ground truth of the randomized control trial is the truth. So why is the real world data not being able to emulate it correctly? So I think as we increase our understanding there about where it does and doesn't work, that will also increase the sort of acceptance of it, because then we'll know, okay, we know the limitations, we know how far, we know that there's going to be potential use cases where actually it's not ever feasible to use real world data. But yeah, I think we're quite early on, is essentially my point, I think.
That's interesting. All right, so I have a left turn question, because I'm worried that Tim's going to cut me off soon.
I was about to. I was like, do I announce that we're going to try to wrap it up, or do we say somebody's going to get one more?
Okay, so this would be I'm going for it. So this is my I've always wondered this. And I'm really hoping, because I've asked multiple doctors, so I know that, Lewis, you've got it for me. Off-label script writing. So when a doctor writes a prescription for something that it's not necessarily indicated for, because they have a reason to believe that this will help you. And I've seen the positive effects of someone writing off-label for me in the past. Does that data bubble up in any way for that drug getting approved for those other indications? I mean, I'm sure there's so many things at play, like, is it profitable for a pharma company to invest in that? I'm sure is one of the factors, but is anyone looking at how those drugs are being written for things they aren't indicated for, to see if there's a business case for figuring out whether or not that is something that should be explored and approved? Or is that data going to any good use?
No, that's a fascinating one. I completely agree. And I think you really hit on where real world data will always be the advantage over randomized control trials. Because I think not only did I hit on, you can understand how the treatment effect might vary in particular ethnic minority groups or underrepresented groups more broadly. You can then look at things like, exactly as you say, where the drug is being used in a slightly different indication, that will never be reflected in clinical trials. And that's where real world data is always going to be the only way that you're going to collect that data. I don't know if there are initiatives. I think it's certainly, you've given me a hell of a sort of idea going forward. So that data exists. We would know. I mean, the type of granularity of data that we work with here, it's incredibly deep. So we would know hang on, that, this drug is being used, but I know it shouldn't be used within, this type of patient because, they haven't gone through the right treatment pathways or they have the slightly different treatment profile. So it certainly is possible. I know that. Maybe, I don't know whether this is related, but it's a potentially useful side point anyway. Real world data has also been really useful for label expansion as well. So probably one of the most sort of poster child of this is a breast cancer treatment that was expanded to male patients with breast cancer, because as you imagine, male breast cancer is really, really quite rare. And so it's really quite difficult to understand the effect and run a randomized control trial for the men for the same drugs that women receive. So real world data has the advantage in that you can look at population level over, typically some of our data goes back to the year 2000. So over a 25 year period, we can look at all of the male breast cancer patients. We can then use real world data to go, well, let's have a look for patients who may have got that treatment or not got that treatment and do a comparison. And then in conjunction with the randomized control trial that's been done on female patients, we can create a sort of a pretty convincing use case that actually this drug should be expanded to male patients as well as female patients. So I think in that case, that sort of potentially hits on where you can sort of go with that off-label usage, which is around label expansion. So yeah, I think that's the closest I can get to try and help you with that one.
Oh, that's interesting.
Wow. I mean, this is definitely one we could go for hours. This is almost making me want to, be eager for the day that Facts and Feelings, signs a pharma client so I can get back into the world of all the intricacies. Julie's like, yeah, don't be careful what you wish for.
Tim, I'm going to bring this recording back up when it happens. I'm going to remind you said this.
And you know what? As a medical statistician on this program as well, I didn't get into one part of sort of the medical stats that we do. So that was quite impressive. But I feel like I provided a wealth of other information.
This was great. I will say I had back when I was in business school, and I had a little start. I was part of a little startup through a Moot Corp competition that was a home self-administered pap smear was the technology. And we were in business school, so we'd had a stats class, but we got funding and we went to a medical statistician, and he was trying to explain to us what the 10 patients in just a purely all treated, that was not really going to give us the sort of statistical, oomph that we were hoping for with that product. And we're like, but why? We definitely observed,
I don't think you need Lewis to tell you.
Yeah. No, I've reflected on that many times over the years that, that was
So I have a question for you guys in the marketing side. Is p-values something that come up with you guys as well in terms of, I presume it is, and obviously in medicine it's almost like this, unfortunately, much to my disdain, sort of the herald of whether a treatment should move forward or not. Is that similar in sort of your field?
I feel like it's coming up more and more. We wind up having sort of from a experimental design, A/B testing design, a Bayesian versus a frequentist approach, which means then the Bayesians come and, bludgeon the frequentists. And I feel like I see a lot more of the, don't just treat just the p-value as the thing. It's an arbitrary threshold, but then even trying to get marketers to kind of understand what it means or doesn't. So I feel like it bubbles up a lot, and then a lot of people who probably should be thinking about it run away.
Well, even Tim, you did a keynote a couple years ago about did this metric move enough for me to care? Was kind of the underpinning of it, because if you're comparing 15% from this source to 17%, that's so much more, and it's let's be a little bit more critical about that. So I think that marketers are coming around. I definitely think that's a really common conversation with the people you'll find on this podcast and a lot of our listeners. But yeah, convincing those marketers to be on the same page is, sometimes a challenge.
Good. I'm glad that we're all fighting the same fight.
Well, I mean, this was everything I was hoping the discussion would be and more.
Good.
And it's it's just, I love having these sorts of discussions about an expert coming from somewhere else. I'm like, so much is the same, and there's so much you're in better shape, but you're also in worse shape. So I'm I love it. I want to follow Julie around for the rest of the day and just watch every conversation she has for the next 48 hours.
Yeah, I'm going to be the broken record.
Yeah.
I'm going to be like, Julie keeps going on and on about this stuff.
All right. So before we wrap up, we like to finish every episode by going around and having everybody share a last call, just something that's interesting that they've found, related or not to this specific topic. And Lewis, you're our guest, so do you have a last call to share?
Yeah, I do actually. I would highly recommend a podcast called When Things Fell Apart, I think it's called. So this is a fantastic podcast that looks at, particularly, I think series 2 looks at COVID era and how a number of sort of conspiracy theories and sort of events across various different sort of cultural aspects sort of manifested. And so it's an incredible insight to how these conspiracy theories kind of start and how almost benign they are at the beginning and then how they manifest and sort of develop over time. And so, yeah, certainly a really, really interesting listen and a fantastic sort of insight into sort of human behavior. And it does, as I say, it moves into sort of COVID vaccine conspiracy. So still linked to healthcare in some respect.
I love that. That's actually,
Humans,
Julie,
yeah.
the idea for the upcoming episode that you've been chatting with us about. I feel like that's going to be like a wealth of information for some really interesting threads to follow there.
Well, look at Val dropping the teaser for an as yet unplanned episode that could occur in the next 12 to 18 months. Your punishment for that, Val, is what is your last call?
Not a punishment. I've actually been holding on to this one. So I feel like every third last call that I give is something that was published on the UX Collective medium. But this was a really good one. It was really interesting. The piece is called Complicated Sticks, The Rise of Tools for Everything and Nothing in Particular. And so I was hooked by the title. But it starts by talking about that Apple iPad ad that got like a lot of negative publicity, where there was like all the different, instruments and calculators, and it like smashes into an iPad Pro. But the whole piece is talking about how there's like all these tech products out there that are like, we can do everything. So like, what do you want to do with it? Like, and how the pendulum has swung from being really tightly tied to the use cases of the user for one specific thing, but now it's just the everything to everyone and sometimes nothing to a lot of people who have really deep skills. So there's a lot of really interesting examples in here and advertisements, and it's from a product perspective. So it's definitely an interesting read. So complicated.
I'm shocked not at all that the one specific example you pulled from it was actually like an Apple fail. So you have stayed very, very on brand.
Android PC user for life.
Yeah. All right. Julie, what's your last call?
So mine, actually, Lewis, I was so afraid when you said you had a podcast that you were going to say this podcast, and I would have panicked.
There are like 5 podcasts out now, I hear. There's like, yeah.
Okay, I'll explain why. But because the way you were introing it, I was like, oh my gosh, what are the chances he says the same one? Because it's a BBC radio podcast, and it's about statistics. So it's called The More or Less, Behind the Statistics. And I actually got this off a list of podcasts that Analytics Power Hour was part of. And so I was, excited to see that on LinkedIn, and I was looking at all the other podcasts, always, searching for new stuff to listen to. And so I happened to listen to this one, and it was very interesting. It's really short bites of like 9 to 30 minutes, and it takes statistics that are out there in different headlines or floating around, or people are using them in arguments and discussions. And it looks into like the studies behind them and says if they're really valid or not. And they have like some interviews and things in them. So just as like a teaser, 3 of the titles that caught my eye, and I only got to listen to a couple so far, but it was, is intermittent fasting going to kill you? Are falling marriage rates causing happiness to fall in the US? And is reading for pleasure the single biggest factor in how well a child does in life? And I was like hooked. I've just been scrolling through like, oh my gosh, which one am I going to listen to next? Fun because it ties into the teaser Val was giving anyways.
Was Tim Harford the presenter on the ones that you've listened to?
Yes.
Past Analytics Power Hour guest, Tim Harford? Yeah. So that's good. You should give that episode a listen. He's delightful. So I will plus one more or less. Like, they're short, which is nice. So
The only thing I would add, though, is as I say, I'm a bit mortified I didn't use more or less. So, Julie, so I think I'm glad for you, but not glad.
See, there was a chance it was stolen. I was nervous.
So I listened to it for the UK listeners. It's on at 9 o'clock on BBC Radio 4. So it's my commute in to the work every Wednesday. But just a warning that for the last 2-3 weeks, it's all been very UK election focused. So yes, so a little sort of more on point.
And we were recording before. I think we know how that one's going to turn out. We're recording before the 4th of July when that actually happens. So we'll tease that out. But all right,
Tim. How about you?
So my last call, I think I've gone to I will also I've gone to this well before, but Annie Duke did an interview with the co-authors of a book called Is Your Work Worth It? Which I have not read the book. It's Christopher Wong Michelson and Jennifer Tosti Karas. But the premise, it's a pretty lengthy interview, and the premise is that you've got the old like Mark Twain quote that if you love what you do for work, you'll never work a day, or if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And their premise is like, let's not paint things quite that way, that, it's just on you to find your passion and then, all happiness will come. So it's a much, much more nuanced view and how it might be okay it is okay if your job is your job and you use the job to give you funding to pursue what you're really interested in, or, you have some mix between it. And they've done a lot of research into different groups, like the people who always wanted to do X, but they were just going to work until they could do X. And then they die, suddenly and tragically. And it's kind of like, yeah. And then what is the family saying? Like, they never got to go back to, be a middle school teacher. So it's a kind of a thoughtful piece around kind of where work fits into our life, and that there's not one single right way to think about work. It also, which wasn't super tied to the specific post, but the Christopher, the one co-author, deep in this interview, like I just loved what he said about AI, where he said, I would like to believe that intelligence that's artificial will never be able to replicate some of the human creativity that we possess. I would find that human life had a lot less meaning if we were able to do that, which I just thought was like it put into words what I've kind of been struggling with a lot with the AI, that what is the piece that it can fall under. So I really, really like that quote. So
good one.
All right. Well, Lewis, thank you again for coming on. This was a really fun, and I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming on. No show would be complete if we did not thank our producer, Josh Crowhurst, who will take our verbal flubs throughout this discussion and make them go away, which means you did not hear any of them, although he did the best I could with me. So we'd also love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts or resources or reflections from this episode or other episodes, reach out to us on the Measure Slack or on our LinkedIn page. We're easy to find. Since I'm kind of sitting in the chair best held down by Michael Helbling, I will, as I always do, use the opportunity to note that you can get your podcast stickers for free by going to bit.ly/APH-stickers. For those of you who actually filled out the survey we were doing a couple of months ago, thank you for doing that. And you all already are getting stickers, and some of you actually got hoodies. And we got some great feedback from that. So thank you for those of you who actually filled out that survey. But with that, regardless of whether you are using real world data, whether you're generating valid real world evidence, whether you're running RCTs, or whether you're just trying to once again explain what the hell a p-value is, for myself, for Val, for Julie, keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening. Let's keep the conversation going with your comments, suggestions, and questions on Twitter at @AnalyticsHour, on the web at analyticshour.io, our LinkedIn group, and the Measure Chat Slack group. Music for the podcast by Josh Crowhurst.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles and the analysis about where there is the intersection, right?
Okay, how's now? This is my natural volume.
Does that seem good?
If I get excited, maybe a little louder.
Okay,
It's okay
that's
then.
good.
I'm not like making anyone deaf. Okay.
Yeah.
My poor husband recently went to a concert and then got an ear infection from it, so
Oh, God.
don't want to give any of you ear infections.
Wait, he got an ear infection from the
volume.
concert? What was he doing at the concert?
I don't know, it was loud. He came home, he's like, after a concert, he's like, oh, my ear's kind of bothering me, and goes to bed,
I've
wakes up.
never heard
2
of
days
that.
later, he had an ear infection.
Was he like sticking his fingers in his
I don't know,
ear?
they were like, your eardrum looks inflamed.
Who did he see?
Yeah.
That's the most.
The Stones.
Oh, he went
It
to
was
the
the
thing.
Stones.
Wow,
okay.
our trainer
In
went to
Cleveland,
that.
Yeah, with his dad and some family.
My wife's
Yeah.
cousin went to that. Okay, yeah. Seemed like
I'm sure they didn't get ear infections from it. I don't know, you just got
Liz, do you have
lucky.
any research on that?
Yeah.
That's not enough.
Yeah,
I wish
any
I
ear
did.
infection data you could share.
yeah, that real world
All right.
data. So okay.
I didn't want to jinx this, but I thought near the end, I was like, I don't think there's going to be much editing other than taking like the outtakes out. Like, it was so smooth.
I know, I'm a
Congratulations,
little bit worried
Julie.
about that.
You just generated an outtake. I knew that if I waited long enough.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
Rock flag and so many acronyms.